There are units in history that make even hardened soldiers whisper. One name does that on its own: Oskar Dirlewanger, a commander whose very presence meant the rules no longer applied. A unit built not from the best of the best, but from men the regime itself once called criminals, and then unleashed. The result wasn't a strategy, it was a storm, a project that began as a so-called rehabilitation experiment and ended as a travelling catastrophe that left villages erased, hospitals emptied at gunpoint, and a city turned into a charnel house. This is how a decorated First World War veteran with a doctorate became the architect of a terror unit so reviled that even some SS officers called them animals. It's how that unit learned to destroy faster than it could fight. And it's why, at the end, the story doesn't close with a tidy line under justice served, but with rumours, evasions, and a legacy that refused to die. We'll move fast, no long detours. Each section drops a new piece of the puzzle and locks it in place. By the end, you'll see the pattern, how a state can take criminality, call it discipline, and sell it as order. But that wasn't the whole story. Oskar Dirlewanger and the SS unit of atrocity. In the grim tapestry of World War II atrocities, few threads are as dark as that of the Dirlewanger Brigade. Even among units built for terror, this formation stood apart. Officially styled Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, it was assembled not from the regime's supposed elite, but from men with prison records, and then encouraged to act like it. One SS investigator put it with brutal clarity. Dirlewanger's men were not soldiers, but a band of criminals. The point of the experiment wasn't discipline, it was licensed savagery dressed in field grey. To understand how such a unit could exist, you have to start with its namesake. Oskar Dirlewanger was born in 1895 in Würzburg and took what looked, at first, like a conventional path. He volunteered in World War I, bled in trench mud, and earned both classes of the Iron Cross with the 123rd Grenadier Regiment. He returned with scars and a reputation for effectiveness, then surprised those who knew him by completing the doctorate in political science at the University of Frankfurt, his dissertation, ironically, on the labour service system. On paper, veteran, scholar, rising functionary. In practice, a man whose impulses would soon outrun any credential. The interwar years exposed the core. Dirlewanger joined the Nazi movement early, 1922, and took part in the failed 1923 putsch. Through the late 1920s and early 1930s, he built a name for heavy drinking and street violence, leading brawling squads in Stuttgart while holding a welfare officer's job by day. The facade finally cracked in 1934. Accusations surfaced that he had taken advantage of a young woman from the League of German Girls. In court, additional allegations emerged pointing to multiple victims. He was sentenced to 2 years, expelled from the party and the SA, and, by the regime's public standards, finished. He wasn't. Dirlewanger's path back ran through patronage and war. Gottlob Berger, an old comrade rising inside the SS, argued that Dirlewanger's useful qualities outweighed his weaknesses. Seeking rehabilitation, Dirlewanger volunteered for the Spanish Civil War in 1936 with the Condor Legion. Reports claim that by the Battle of Teruel in 1938, he had embraced methods that blurred the line between punishment and murder, approaches he would later magnify in the East. He returned to Germany in 1939 with a Spanish cross in silver and partial restoration of status. In a system that prized results over restraint, those were the only references he needed. World War II gave the scheme its stage. As manpower tightened, Berger pitched a radical fix to Heinrich Himmler, form a special unit from convicted poachers. The theory sounded almost romantic. Woodsmen who could track, shoot, and vanish, redeployed against partisans. Himmler liked the experiment, and in June 1940 the Wilddieb-Kommando Oranienburg, the poachers' commando, was born under Dirlewanger. In a line meant to sound uplifting, Himmler described the plan as turning a social element into useful members of the Germanic community. In reality, it turned criminal dependency into a weapon. Freedom would be conditional. Loyalty would be absolute. The first roster, around 80 poachers released from camps and prisons, already broke SS norms. The organization sold itself as racially elite with strict vetting. This unit advertised the opposite. And it didn't stay limited to poachers. As the war expanded, especially after the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, the unit grew by relaxing its rules. Robbers joined, convicted killers joined, men with records of sexual predation joined. The formation's purpose shifted in step from anti-partisan craftwork to mobile terror. One early recruit, a notorious Bavarian poacher who had served 8 years for shooting a gamekeeper, became one of Dirlewanger's favoured subordinates, a telling promotion in a unit where ruthlessness outranked skill. Training was minimal and loyalty tests were maximal. Indoctrination at Sachsenhausen in 1940 focused less on tactics than on devotion to the commander. Discipline did not flow from a code, it flowed from fear. Dirlewanger beat subordinates, executed those who displeased him, and cultivated an atmosphere where cruelty proved belonging. In one documented case, he shot a soldier who refused to take part in killing young people, a message to everyone watching that hesitation would be answered with a bullet. A former member summarized the ethos after the war. The only rule was that there were no rules. This wasn't just a personnel problem, it was policy in motion. The unit's early operations in occupied territories measured success by body counts rather than security. Reports would boast of hundreds or thousands eliminated, while listing only handfuls of weapons captured. Ratios that confessed the truth without meaning to. Unarmed civilians bore the brunt. The logic hardened in Belarus and Ukraine and would later reach its most infamous expression in Warsaw. Not everyone on the German side applauded. Wehrmacht officers in the Army Group Center rear area protested that Dirlewanger's methods created more partisans than they destroyed. One October 1942 memo lamented a bunch of criminal elements and a disgrace to our army. Civil administrators complained that indiscriminate killing emptied fields, wrecked harvests, and sabotaged the very exploitation Berlin demanded. A district official from the Barisor region filed a formal protest, writing that the unit's practices had rendered entire agricultural areas useless through depopulation. None of it mattered. The complaints reached headquarters and died there. Dirlewanger, meanwhile, received commendations and promotions, up to SS-Sturmbannführer by 1943. Himmler visited the unit that year and reportedly told him, "The Führer and I watch your progress with particular interest." The signal was unmistakable. Body counts were currency, and the man who delivered them would be rewarded. By late 1942, the formation had grown to battalion strength, then beyond, circulating through Belarus, parts of Ukraine, and eventually Poland, wherever bandit fighting provided cover for annihilation. What made the Dirlewanger Brigade uniquely terrifying wasn't just the criminality of its members, but the way the institution cultivated their worst impulses. Other formations committed atrocities by order. This one recruited men predisposed to violence and told them their impulses were not only permitted but prized. The result was a feedback loop. Crimes earned praise, praise licensed further crimes. As one historian argued, the unit was not an aberration of the Nazi system, but its logical conclusion, the fusion of ideology and instinct, unconstrained by even minimal moral boundaries. That's the frame for everything that follows. A decorated veteran with a doctorate became the avatar of a project that weaponized criminality and called it security. A penal commando evolved into a traveling catastrophe, protected from censure and fed with promotions. The numbers on the reports went up. The number of weapons captured did not. The regime looked at the ratio and saw success. Villages, hospitals, and churches saw something else entirely. This is where the story tilts from origins to outcomes. The methods refined in forests and marshes would soon be turned loose on communities that thought walls and wards could shield them. They couldn't. The next chapter isn't about ideology on paper. It's about doors kicked in at dawn and squares filled under rifles, about a city that dared to rise and met a unit built to erase. But that wasn't the whole story. Witnessing the atrocities of the Dirlewanger Brigade, the forests did not hide the truth. They amplified it. In the summer of 1942, the dense woods of Belarus whispered the same story from village to village. Places that had stood for centuries were wiped out in hours. Their people swept into a machine that called itself bandit fighting and behaved like organised extermination. Under that euphemism, the Dirlewanger Brigade turned the countryside into a testing ground for annihilation. Reports filed with tidy language bragged of bandits eliminated, then quietly admitted how few weapons were found. The ratio told the real story. This was not conventional anti-partisan warfare, it was the destruction of the unarmed. One operation in the Pripyat marshes made the numbers impossible to ignore. 6,657 people killed and only 259 rifles captured. In the village of Bori alone, 1,741 villagers were recorded as dead in November 1942, including 950 young souls. A line in the unit's operational diary, captured after the war, read like a verdict: mission accomplished. Village no longer exists. That sentence is the method, distilled. The pattern rarely changed. At dawn, Dirlewanger's men ringed a settlement so no one could escape. Everyone was driven to the central square. A quick selection followed. Those judged fit were shipped off as slave workers. The elderly, the infirm, and young souls were marched into the largest wooden building, a barn, a schoolhouse, a church, barred inside and set ablaze. A Wehrmacht officer who watched one of these fires near Minsk wrote, "The screams from inside that burning building will haunt me until my dying day," then added the detail that refuses to fade. And the men were laughing. In July 1942, the village of Dori became a single, endless minute. They herded everyone inside, blocked the doors with benches, poured gasoline, and threw in grenades, recalled the sole survivor, Varvara Konova. "I survived only because the dead fell on top of me." Her sentence is spare because it has to be. No adjective can carry that weight. Cruelty escalated as routine set in. Survivors and German witnesses described games that turned killing into sport. In winter, women were forced to wade into freezing water to retrieve objects, then shot for target practice as they emerged. Another game, reported in post-war testimony, had victims injected with strychnine so men could watch the convulsions and call it scientific research. An SS man who later served with the unit said, "Even among those of us who had become accustomed to killing, the Dirlewanger method stood out as exceptionally cruel." In one town, the brigade reportedly forced women to dance naked around a bonfire made from their own clothing before subjecting them to unspeakable degradation and gunfire. A deserter who reached Sweden in 1943 testified that Dirlewanger personally selected victims and encouraged his officers to compete for creativity in torture. The incentives were clear. Sadism earned approval. Hesitation earned a bullet. The worst stories are about the youngest. Multiple witnesses spoke of bayonets used as stakes and small bodies thrown into burning buildings. In the village of Pekalin, according to Soviet commission files, soldiers lined up children so a single bullet could pass through several at once and count as more kills. A German military police report from October 1942 did not hide its disgust. The conduct of SS-Sonderkommando D with regard to the Belarusian civilian population, especially the young, represents a level of barbarism unprecedented even in this theatre. In the hamlet of Kozly, near Bwansk, survivor Anna Lysenko said the men gathered 26 young souls in a schoolhouse, shooting them one by one while forcing the others to watch. The last child, Mikhail Petro, was spared only to be used as a human target for bayonet practice. An SS liaison officer, later infamous as the Führer's brother-in-law, complained directly, "Dirlewanger's men shoot young souls for sport. This is not combat, it's lunacy." When a unit disgusts even its own apparatus, you know the line has been crossed, trampled and mocked. By 1944, as the Eastern Front collapsed and the axis of the war shifted, the brigade had swollen to regimental size and was redirected to a new theatre, Warsaw. Its reputation preceded it. "These are not men, but wild beasts pumped up with vodka," a senior SS commander reportedly remarked as they arrived to help crush the Polish Home Army's uprising. The orders were explicit and simple enough to fit inside a breath. Any inhabitant you encounter is to be killed, regardless of whether they are men, women, or young souls. When authority pairs vagueness about targets with perfect clarity about killing, the result is never a battle. It is a massacre. They entered Warsaw on August 4, 1944. What followed over 5 days in the Wola district still stretches comprehension. The brigade went building to building with a method so practiced it felt mechanical. Hospitals became the first targets because hospitals symbolize continuity and care. At one, witnesses said patients were shot in their beds and the building burned with the wounded still inside. At St. Lazarus, men remembered Dirlewanger overseeing the murder of medical staff and patients, pausing only to choose women for degrading entertainment before killing them too. A surgeon survived by chance. "They burst into the surgical ward while I was operating," he recalled. "They shot my patient on the table, then lined us against the wall. I survived only because an artillery shell hit nearby, creating enough confusion for me to escape through a window." August 5th became the peak of horror. Estimates for that day alone speak in terrible ranges, tens of thousands of civilians dead over the span of a long weekend. St. Adalbert's Church turned into a trap. Hundreds died inside the nave under machine gun fire. The Ursus factory became a firing line where men, women, and the elderly were marched to walls and shot in groups. At a factory complex on Wolska Street, more than 4,000 people were executed that day. The killing was so efficient that the General in Overall Command modified orders on August the 9th, not from mercy but from math, directing that many women and children be expelled rather than murdered on the spot. "I had to change Himmler's order," he said later, "because Dirlewanger's men were so busy murdering civilians, they forgot we had an armed uprising to suppress. When the slaughter delays the war, even the butchers get told to move along. Survivor voices from Warsaw don't need length to have force. Wanda Lurie, pregnant at the time, lay in a pile of bodies after being hit multiple times. They shot us with machine guns," she said. "I received 4 bullet wounds in my back. The bullets penetrated my right arm and both my hips." She waited until night, crawled away, and, against every odd, later delivered a healthy son in a transit camp. Janina Rosinska remembered the student dormitory at Żelazna turning into a torture center. They selected women daily for their entertainment. None returned alive. We could hear their screams all night. An underground courier wrote in her diary that Dirlewanger himself set up a harem in a commandeered apartment for the officers' use. These are not lurid details. They are the architecture of a crime that fed on humiliation as much as on death. And yet, when faced with people who could shoot back, the brigade revealed itself. Against barricades held by Home Army fighters, Dirlewanger's men flung themselves forward in sloppy assaults and were cut down. In the first 10 days, the formation lost around 40% of its strength. That staggering attrition was patched over by press-ganging men from wherever they could be grabbed: Soviet prisoners, forced laborers, Hungarian Jews forced to haul ammunition to the front without weapons. A senior SS officer radioed upstairs in exasperation, "What should I do with these men? They're more dangerous to us than to the enemy." On Okupowa Street, a single machine gun and Molotovs held back 3 consecutive attacks, inflicting more than 70 casualties. A field commander kept a diary with a sentence that ought to be engraved: "A collection of criminals who can murder defenseless women but collapse when facing actual resistance." The revulsion wasn't limited to army officers. Inside the SS itself, investigators tried to act. Judge Georg Konrad Morgan, famous for probing crimes within the camps, opened files on theft, violence, and immoral conduct only to be blocked by Himmler's office. An internal 1943 review warned the brigade was in danger of losing its soldierly value due to its composition. Bureaucratic code for "this is a mob we can't control." It didn't slow their promotions. The commandant of Gross Rosen is reported to have muttered, "And they call us criminals," after watching the brigade at work. Even a notoriously brutal Gauleiter complained that the unit undermines German authority and disgraces the uniform, pleading to have them removed from his region. The most telling detail is that such complaints mattered less than body count reports. As long as the numbers kept climbing, the door stayed open. For those who lived through it, the war never ended. A nurse from Holy Trinity Hospital said decades later, "I still hear the screams of my patients as they were dragged from their beds. Some of them clung to me, begging for help I couldn't provide." In Belarus, the erasure was so complete that post-war teams sometimes could not find where villages had stood. One name, Katyn, became a symbol for hundreds of others. Its memorial shows the only adult male survivor, blacksmith Józef Kamiński, cradling his burned son. He carried him out of the ruins alive. The boy died in his arms. A writer who shaped those testimonies into a documentary novel kept the sentence that should close any argument about forgetting: "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is a duty of the living to do so for them." This is what it means to witness the atrocities of the Dirlewanger Brigade, to follow the method from the square to the barn, from the corridor to the ward, from the order sheet to the firing line, and to hear the short, unadorned sentences that survive when every other detail burns away. The next chapter puts a name to that method and shows how the countryside became the template for a city. Operation Annihilation, Belarus to Warsaw, where the experiment in weaponized criminality reached its most concentrated, catastrophic form. But that wasn't the whole story. An Operation Annihilation. The word looked clinical on paper. In practice, it meant a unit that ran on liquor, pills, and permission slips. The morning after a successful sweep in the Belarusian village of Dori in July 1942, Oskar Dirlewanger walked into a scene that said more about his formation than any report ever could. A company commander unconscious beside empty schnapps bottles and a female prisoner lying dead. There was no arrest, no court-martial, no sermon. Dirlewanger ordered the body removed, splashed the officer with cold water and sent him back to work. A Wehrmacht liaison who recorded the incident understood the headline. This was not a normal military unit. This was a machine tuned to brutality and held together by fear. Inside the brigade, discipline did not come from a code. It came from a bottle and a threat. Alcohol requisitions ballooned until administrators complained that a 3-month allotment vanished in 2 weeks. Men joked about field pharmacies, boxes of stimulants, especially Pervitin, issued as casually as rations. A medical officer who served with the unit during the Warsaw Uprising wrote that roughly 80% of the men were operating under alcohol or stimulants during actions. His diary entry for August 7, 1944, reads like a diagnosis of collapse. Amputated the foot of Rottenführer Schulz, self-inflicted while intoxicated. Third such incident this week. He ended with a line that is hard to forget. These men fight not with courage, but with chemical courage. The drink didn't just blur fear. It sharpened cruelty. The unit's reputation grew so foul that German authorities in Belarus reportedly hid alcohol when word spread the brigade was approaching. Fights inside the ranks often ended with shots, not shouts. A deserter who reached Sweden in 1943 testified that brawls turned deadly with numbing regularity, at least once a week, and that the officers were the worst, shooting subordinates for slights as small as a tone of voice. In November 1942, a company commander near Minsk shot 3 of his own men for falling asleep on guard and left their bodies on display. Dirlewanger approved. He encouraged it. Terror was both the product the unit sold and the internal policy that kept it running. When the brigade deployed to crush the Slovak uprising in 1944, one officer executed 5 of his own men for trying to desert with stolen goods. The reward was not punishment, it was promotion. Dirlewanger reportedly praised him with a sentence that functioned as doctrine. You understand how to handle these animals. According to post-war personnel files, the brigade lost almost as many men to internal violence and executions, over 100 documented cases, as it did to partisan attacks during its Belarusian campaign. Bodies piled up on both sides of the firing line. What the brigade did to women, civilians, and even its own auxiliaries stripped away any remaining pretense of order. In Belarus, the unit installed so-called comfort stations, which were in truth cages for exploitation. A town hall in Łowice became one such site. A survivor remembered that most captives died within weeks from abuse and neglect. German women assigned as nurses and radio operators faced such persistent misconduct that in June 1943, SS headquarters issued a directive forbidding the mistreatment of female SS auxiliaries. It made little difference. A German Red Cross nurse who briefly served with the unit wrote, "These are not men, but animals. I fear for my life every night and have barricaded my door, but still they try to break in. No one will help." When she reported the assaults, a senior SS official allegedly replied, "Be thankful you escaped with your life. We do not send our best men to Dirlewanger." In Warsaw, the brigade commandeered a school on Storky Street for its headquarters and turned rooms into holding pens for women dragged in from nearby blocks. A Polish underground courier who escaped described torture with lit cigarettes and entertainment that ended only with death. Dirlewanger himself stood atop this system of rot, ruling with a mix of personal brutality and selective indulgence. He shot men who hesitated to carry out atrocities. During an operation in the Białowieża forest in early 1943, he executed a 19-year-old SS man who refused to help burn a village and then addressed the assembled unit with a lesson that everyone understood. This is what happens to those too weak for our work. Meanwhile, he granted wide latitude to those who proved their zeal. His personal orderly, known for carrying out the commander's executions, was allowed to choose women from captured villages for his own use. He later died in Warsaw, so drunk he allegedly wandered into a resistance position and straight into machine gun fire. Dirlewanger's own drinking was legend. An inspector wrote in late 1942 that the commander appears to be perpetually intoxicated, yet maintains an iron grip on his men through unpredictable outbursts of violence. That volatility poisoned every relationship beyond the unit's walls. Wehrmacht officers filed complaint after complaint. One rear area commander sent a scathing report to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, describing the brigade as a collection of criminals and deviants who disgrace the uniform. A staff officer scribbled in his diary, "The excesses of the Dirlewanger unit are so revolting that they're discussed even at the front. Every decent soldier feels shame about such comrades." When the brigade siphoned fuel and ammunition from army stockpiles without authorization, a major general tried to have Dirlewanger arrested. SS authorities blocked it. The disgust reached all the way to the top of the army. General Hans Krebs told his wife after encountering the brigade near Mogilev in 1943, "I have seen today what hell looks like. It wears German uniforms and calls itself a special commando." Another general refused to billet Dirlewanger's men near his troops, writing, "I cannot guarantee the safety of either party. My men have expressed their intention to execute these criminals at the first opportunity." When professional soldiers talk like that about a unit on their own side, the word breakdown stops being metaphor. Even within the SS, which had no shortage of blood on its hands, the brigade stood beyond the pale. A senior SS and police leader in occupied Poland tried to expel the unit from his jurisdiction after witnessing its behavior during anti-Jewish operations, warning Himmler, "These men are a greater danger to German order than the enemies they supposedly combat." Judge Georg Konrad Morgan opened an investigation into theft and immoral offences, only to see it quashed from above. Another inspector summarized the formation in a sentence that has echoed ever since. "This is not a military formation, but a mobile asylum for the criminally insane. Their behavior brings dishonor to the Black Corps." Even a notorious collaborator brigade in Warsaw, no strangers to atrocities, looked at Dirlewanger's methods and muttered, "We kill, but they torture. Before killing, even we have limits." Why did nothing change? Protection. Dirlewanger enjoyed patrons with long shadows, especially Gottlob Berger at the SS main office. When confronted with evidence of excesses, Berger reportedly sneered, "One cannot fight partisans with Salvation Army methods." In one particularly revealing exchange, a complaint arrived that the brigade had brutalized the daughters of a German administrator in Belarus. Berger's answer was ice. "War brings casualties on all sides. These young women died for Germany too." Himmler didn't just tolerate the unit, he visited it in early 1943, pinned the German cross in gold on Dirlewanger's tunic, and authorized further expansion. Expansion required bodies, and the brigade found them in places that guaranteed trouble. Beginning in late 1943, Dirlewanger's formation drew auxiliaries from starving Soviet prisoners of war with a blunt choice: serve or die. Many chose service and deserted at the first chance. During the Slovak campaign in 1944, an entire company of former Red Army men defected in one night, weapons and all. The response was a standing order: pair every Eastern volunteer with German personnel and never assign them to night guard together. By 1944, the net was cast wider still, into concentration camps. During the Warsaw Uprising, approximately 90 Hungarian Jews were temporarily released to carry ammunition for the brigade at the front, unarmed and exposed. One survivor remembered, "None of us expected to survive. We were expendable bodies, nothing more." Only 7 of the 90 lived through the uprising, slipping away in the chaos. This is the underside of Operation Annihilation, not just the devastation inflicted outward, but the culture that devoured inward. Booze in place of orders, pills in place of training, favoritism in place of law. The formation could terrorize a village before sunrise and stumble into its own bullets by noon. It could fill a report with results and then fail a simple tactical test at a barricade. It could make senior officers in its own army fear for their men's safety and still collect medals for body counts. The logic held until the war no longer did. When the front lines buckled and tanks arrived, chemical courage wasn't enough, and terror stopped working as a tactic. That's when the hunters became the hunted, and the formation that called itself a division tried to run through a world that had learned its name and vowed not to forgive it. The next chapter isn't about license, it's about consequences, the violent dissolution of a unit designed to destroy others, and in the end, very good at destroying itself. The violent dissolution of Dirlewanger's brigade. The last act opened in snow and smoke. February 1945, the Buda Hills, the Dirlewanger Brigade, once nearly 4,000 strong, had dwindled to barely 700 men. Against the Soviet 6th Guards tank army, they were outgunned, outmaneuvered and out of time. The unit that had terrorized villages now fought like a cornered pack, lashing out and breaking apart. One former member put it without romance. In the end, we ran like jackals. The hunters had become the hunted. For men who knew their reputation, capture felt like a sentence. Many decided to gamble on flight instead. The unravelling had started months earlier. After the Warsaw rampage and losses that chewed through almost half their strength, the brigade was hurriedly reconstituted with convicts and foreign conscripts, then thrown into Slovakia to batter the national uprising. The hills around Banska Bystrica taught them a lesson they never learned in the marshes. Courage on a barricade beats cruelty in a barn. After-action notes from October 1944 recorded 216 men lost in 3 weeks, a hemorrhage the regime could no longer hide with quick drafts. The brutality didn't fade with the defeats. In Kremnička, the brigade executed 747 civilians, among them 211 women and 58 young souls. Their bodies rolled into anti-tank ditches. A Slovak partisan officer summed up their style with the contempt it deserved. They fought as they lived, without courage or honor. They were brave only when facing unarmed villages. From there the retreat turned into drift. Across Slovakia and into Hungary, discipline, never more than a mask, fell away. A Wehrmacht liaison wrote the diagnosis in one line. The formation was no longer a cohesive unit, but a collection of armed groups scavenging their way west. Desertions spiked, especially among coerced non-German recruits. By November 1944, nearly half of the Eastern volunteers were gone. Some melted into forests and villages, some tried to surrender to Soviet spearheads. That rarely saved them. In the town of Kecsket, 23 pressed former Red Army soldiers approached Soviet troops with their hands up. When blood group tattoos under their arms gave away their Dirlewanger service, all 23 were shot. Inside the brigade, diaries grew blunt. Discipline completely broken down in 3rd Company, one officer wrote on December 14, 1944. Shot 2 men for attempting to desert last night. The others watched, but showed no reaction. They are already dead inside. Early 1945 pushed them into hopeless lines around Budapest and Lake Balaton. Orders came to hold ground against tanks with almost no anti-armor. The results were predictable and final. Soviet intercepts preserved the broken rhythm of Dirlewanger's radio calls. Ammunition exhausted, enemy tanks breaking through. Request permission to withdraw. The Soviets knew exactly who they were facing. "We have identified the butchers of Warsaw," one frontline dispatch declared. "No quarter will be given." On February 14, 1945, near Székesfehérvár, T-34s slammed into the brigade's headquarters company and crushed it. Of 122 men captured there, Soviet records say only 14 lived long enough to reach POW camps. By April, Germany itself was disintegrating. The brigade splintered into groups chasing a rumor, reach American or British lines and you might live. The last thread of cohesion snapped when word spread that Dirlewanger had abandoned them, fleeing toward the Alps with a personal escort. The truth was narrower. He'd been wounded by shrapnel in February and evacuated to a field hospital at Altshausen. But perception killed faster than a shell. By the end, it was every man for himself, a captured veteran told American interrogators. The only orders were to run. Some fragments slipped into Austria's Tyrol and managed to surrender. On May 3, 1945, SS Obersturmführer Kurt Vischer and roughly 30 men gave themselves up to the US 42nd Infantry Division. They had stripped off SS uniforms and tried to pass as Wehrmacht stragglers, but the telltales were there. Blood group tattoos, odd insignia stuffed into packs. Other pockets staggered north into Bohemia and found a different welcome. Near Przybram, Czech partisans captured 14 identified Dirlewanger men. Local records say they were buried alive in a derelict mine shaft. Retribution came bare-handed. The fate of Oskar Dirlewanger himself refuses to sit still. The official line is stark. After recovering from his wound, he was picked up by French forces near Altshausen on June 1, 1945, wearing civilian clothes and carrying papers in the name Gregor Berger, a bitter wink at his patron, Gottlob Berger. He was held in a former Wehrmacht barracks and died on June 7, 1945. A French army doctor signed the certificate, cardiac arrest following physical trauma. Clean words, closed file, but the file keeps opening. The most persistent version says that Polish forced labourers, liberated and now serving as guards, recognized him in custody. "We knew exactly who he was," a former resistance fighter recalled, decades later. "What happened to him was nothing compared to what he had done in Warsaw." A French military policeman remembered the barracks mood in a single line. The official story was that he died from his wounds, but everyone knew the Poles got to him. In 1960, an exhumation deepened the doubt. The injuries, the report suggested, matched a sustained beating more than a clean battlefield trauma. The conclusion most historians accept is simple, even if it isn't cinematic. Dirlewanger died in French custody in June 1945. The allure of other endings, escape, disguise, an old man in Cairo or Buenos Aires, says more about our hunger for fitting punishment than about proof. Those ghost rumors had their own life. Intelligence teams in the 1950s chased leads that he had reached Egypt through the same pipelines that carried other fugitives east. A notorious SS fixer reportedly told friends that Dirlewanger slipped out on the Syrian rat line. Argentine immigration rolls seemed to show an alias, Josef Wagner, arriving in 1948 and settling in a region where ex-Nazis gathered. In the end, a famed Nazi hunter cut through the fog. Dirlewanger died in 1945, he concluded. The sightings reflect our fear that such monsters could escape justice more than any reality. The men beneath him did escape, often literally. Middle and lower ranks drifted into post-war Germany and rebuilt lives where neighbors knew only new names. Cold War priorities turned the page faster than courts could write. In East Germany, one former brigade member lived openly under his own name until 1981, when someone finally connected face to file. He received life, was released ill in 1997, and expressed no remorse. "We were just following orders," he told a reporter. In West Germany, a man who'd helped oversee massacres in Belarus joined the Frankfurt police in the 1950s. In 1964, a survivor recognized him during a traffic stop. The case collapsed into legal knots about jurisdiction and wartime law. He served 4 years. Upon release, he shrugged. "The past is the past. Germany has moved forward." Others didn't even bother to pretend they were done with violence. The French Foreign Legion took men who could march and keep quiet. Some Dirlewanger veterans fought in Indochina and Algeria under new flags and false names. One former SS NCO who'd prowled Warsaw died at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, wearing a French uniform and calling himself Claude Servin. Private armies and regimes from Africa to Latin America hired men who advertised counterinsurgency expertise. "What I learned with Dirlewanger served me well in Algeria," one veteran told a German journalist in 1962. "Some methods never change." A former logistics officer resurfaced as an advisor to dictatorships in Paraguay and Chile through the 1960s and 1970s, allegedly exporting interrogation techniques first practiced in Belarus. When asked in Asunción about the moral line, his answer was ice cold. Counterinsurgency is counterinsurgency, whether against communists in Berlin or Santiago. That is the coda no one wanted. The brigade did not end. It metastasized. The unit's banner burned, but its methods traveled into police stations, foreign legions, and the grey economy of military consulting. Courts condemned some, many more slipped under. The record reads less like a verdict than like a warning. Atrocities do not bury themselves. They reappear wearing new insignia. Memory had to do the work. The law often didn't. In Warsaw and across Poland, commemorations kept names alive and details sharp. In Belarus, some villages vanished so completely that post-war investigators had to guess at their borders. One place, Katyn, became a shorthand for hundreds. Its memorial shows a blacksmith, Józef Kamiński, carrying his burned child from the ruins. The boy breathed in his arms and then went still. A writer built a documentary novel from testimonies like that and ended with a sentence that should be engraved on the threshold to any archive. "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is a duty of the living to do so for them." Which brings us to the last lesson. The violent dissolution of Dirlewanger's brigade was not a moral cleanup. It was entropy. A formation built on fear, liquor, and license cannot hold when the scaffolding falls. It breaks into pieces, and those pieces cut new places. The end, when it came, was not a courtroom but a radio gone silent. A group ditching uniforms in a ditch, a name whispered in a barracks, and then crossed out in a ledger. The story doesn't soften because the unit died hard. It hardens because so many who served within it died free. A Polish poet who fought in the uprising wrote the line that fits this ending and every ending like it. The killers simply changed their uniforms. The blood on their hands dried. The sun rose on other countries, other conflicts, other jobs. Their victims were buried, their methods were not. And with that, we close the file, not because it's finished, but because it is ours to carry. Thank you for watching. If history teaches anything, it's that we don't get to forget. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop seeking the truth.